Can we talk? I feel like we can't, actually. At least not at work. We can make word noises out of our faces, but most of it is overly polite, passive-aggressive, aggressive-aggressive, or corporate gobbledegook. It's ridiculous, really. Yet another way our workplaces are distinctly not human. That's why I brought Michael Lee onto this week's DesuckifyWork podcast. He's all about making work more pro-human by helping people have useful conversations, especially ones where we embrace conflict. Conflict helps us learn, solve problems, make ideas better, but we spend so much energy avoiding it because our caveman brains fear we'll get thrown to the woolly mammoths if we don't keep the peace. Also, most of us just suck at conflict. Michael has spent years researching how we can get better at it, and he shares a bunch of those ideas during this episode. My favorite, arguing for someone else's POV, especially one we don't agree with. That practice alone would probably take about 80% of the suck out of workplace communication. It might have an even greater effect on weighty conversations outside of work, like politics, religion, or your favorite Beyonce song. My favorite is the one that's playing out of earshot, but I'd be happy to argue in favor of whatever one you like. Welcome to the DesuckifyWork podcast, the show where we cut through the BS and find ways to make work more fun, more human, and less ridiculous. All of which makes your business more profitable, by the way. This episode is part of our ongoing Pro-Human series in partnership with the Pro-Human Foundation. If you enjoy this one, please like, share, rate, review, or subscribe to the podcast. Let the desuckifying begin. Here's Michael. Okay, Michael Lee, welcome to the DesuckifyWork podcast.
I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for this chance.
Yeah, I'm grateful to have you on. I think we're going to explore a lot of fun stuff today. And I know this is one of the Pro-Human series that I've been doing for my podcast. And you're, as well as I, are both, part of that organization and really support their mission. And what I think is really interesting is broadly their mission is something we both connect to. And then I think about the work you do. And I think it's about as pro-human as it gets when I think about things like civility and trying to help people communicate and connect better. I mean, that's the core of who we are. So I'm looking forward to diving into that.
Thank you. I totally agree. I do think that really what we're doing, at least the work that I do with the Civility Initiative, is about healthy conflict and dialogue across difference. But in the end, that could be about our politics, the media we consume, what we say to each other, how we say it to each other. But in the end, it's relational.
Yeah, I agree. So you want to give us a little more about the work you're doing, and then we'll start diving into some questions?
Sure. The Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston that I direct is really focused on two things. One is how can we have healthier conflicts with one another and get the most out of our conflict so that they're productive and constructive. And the second one is how do we achieve better dialogue across our differences? And we treat those as opportunities for inspiration through events, whether it's speakers or authors or podcast hosts who come and hopefully inspire a crowd to achieve one of those two goals. And we also treat those as skill building opportunities because, as I say a lot, you and I can spend the rest of this podcast talking about how to do something well, like dance or dribble a basketball. But at the end of the podcast, are either of us going to be any better at dancing or dribbling a basketball if we don't actually go out and do it?
Yeah.
Probably not. And so to that end, we have lots of skill building opportunities in high touch, high communication, high visibility trainings with students, faculty, staff, and increasingly local and state governments and workforces to the point of the podcast.
Yeah.
To focus on how they can get better at their communication skill, because communication is a disposition. I would like to communicate with you well, but I can also like to give a great public speech, and I can like it as much as I want to until I'm blue in the face. But if I don't actually try to do it a little more, then I'm probably not going to get much better at it.
Yeah, I totally get that. And it's funny, the work you're now doing more in the workplace. I mean, anybody who's spent any time in a, corporate workplace is just nodding their heads going, yeah, we need some of that. I mean, you were mentioning dribbling a ball, dancing, and I'm like, sometimes just working in a corporate environment feels like we're trying to dance while dribbling a basketball, and you're trying to make a souffle, and you just don't even know where to put your energy sometimes because they're confusing places. and you got stuff coming at you from lots of directions. And we're human beings who don't see eye to eye on how to dribble that ball or how to dance or do those things. And um, really love this idea of skill building because I think we should be just good at this, right? It just feels like, well, it was conflict. I should be able to handle that. That's just part of being human. And yet, the evidence all over is clear we're not very good at it. So, I'm looking forward to exploring what some of those skills might be. But before I do that, since this is the DesuckifyWork podcast, I'd love to get a sense for you. What role does work play in your life?
Oh, we'll start with the softballs, why don't we, TJ? God, it occupies an absolutely enormous part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I have had one job, really, and I have never left until recently left academic spaces. And so work is a part of course, my day-to-day life, but it is also very much a part of my identity. So,
Mm-hmm.
and as I'm saying this, I'm actually feeling some second guessing, maybe even shame around saying it
Yeah.
occupies a huge, huge part of my life. It is not all of my life, but
Mm-hmm.
it is a massive part of my life.
I think that's something we all wrestle with, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, there's a spectrum, right? It can be a job's a job, don't care
Uh-huh.
about it, but it's work. And then the other side is like full on obsession. And I
Hmm.
think for folks who have jobs that, you know, we were drawn to for more than just a paycheck, they can nudge into that space of like, am I putting a little too much of myself into this? Am I holding it too tightly to my identities? I think a lot of folks listening are probably feeling a bit of that where it's like, what is the sweet spot when it comes to how important work should be? Because if I think the fear is if I go too lightly with it, I'm not going to be all in on the work, right?
That's
So it's
right.
it's a tricky one, I think. Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of the song lyrics from the 70s. Hold on loosely, but don't
Yeah.
let go.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good pull. Yeah. That 38 special, right?
There we go. There we go. Well done. Well done.
Yeah. I like that. That's a pretty good motto here. All right. So I'm curious in your experience, what's the biggest factor that can make work suck?
Gosh. Well, connecting it to the work that I do around the civility initiative, I talk a lot about nervous systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so what can make work suck is the same thing that can make lots of stuff suck, which is that if we experience dysregulating stress or distress around
Mm-hmm.
the thing in question, either because we're so avoidant of it because it occupies so much of our universe that we just can't handle it and we shut down. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
a flight reaction,
Yeah.
or maybe the other direction, which is a fight reaction. And that's, of
Mm-hmm.
course, just kind of the TikTok bumper sticker version of what nervous systems do, fight and
Yeah.
flight. There's also other ones, which are freeze reactions, a
Mm-hmm.
different kind of shutdown, and then fawning reactions. And so I think if we're experiencing dysregulating distress around work, that work could suck.
Yeah. And I think, in the work I do as a coach, I'm seeing a lot of nervous system activity that's not where most people I think would want it to be. I think,
Mhm.
people are describing it as stress and anxiety and overwhelm. And then some people are showing up more with burnout where it goes beyond the fight or flight. And maybe that's sort of a form of freeze or something where your body just says, I'm just going to shut it down. I can't, I can't even deal with this. And I think there's a lot of factors here. What I notice is the broader culture, there's a lot of disruption. And so that's just priming our nervous system before we even turn the computer on for work. And then I think a lot of workplaces, we're speeding up more and more and more of the pace of work, new technology, virtual versus, in person. So we're struggling how to connect sometimes. And it's just a soup of dysregulation that we're stepping into. I mean, no wonder we're afraid to kind of engage in conflict,
Uh,
right? I mean, that's what I think that's what I see in a lot of workplaces is you step in and you go, either I don't want to and I'm going to avoid, or when I do, I'm so afraid that I'm just snapping at you. I
Yeah.
mean, what are you seeing that seems to be making it hard for us to engage in the kind of conflict that would actually serve us?
Well, some of the stuff that we do, and when I do healthy conflict coaching, I like to talk about this as a disposition towards, and then also a skill about.
Okay.
And so let's talk about the disposition stuff first. So one of the first questions I ask when I do conflict coaching is, what is you, what is your relationship towards conflict? And I can mean
Mm.
that in an organizational sense. What is the organization's attitude towards conflict?
Mm-hmm.
What is a team, a specific team's attitude towards conflict? And then what is
Mm-hmm.
yours, TJ's,
Yeah.
attitudes towards conflict? And then getting folks to think through a few options. So one option is that conflict is a necessary and inevitable irritant.
Mm.
And I will, like traffic, organize my day around avoiding it as much as possible and minimizing its impact on my nervous system and my
Mm.
life. The second one is that conflict is inevitably explosive. It is a slippery slope, kind of like juggling a grenade. It might not go off, but it very
Yeah.
likely will go off.
Yeah.
And so, how are we armoring ourselves in a fight way, or how are we making ourselves quicker in an escapist flight way to
Mm-hmm.
avoid the blast radius from
Yeah.
the juggling of the grenade? And then
Mm.
the final one is, are we looking at conflict as a tool like fire, which
Mm.
could heat your house and help us make better decisions,
Mm-hmm.
or burn our house down? So that's the disposition. So I ask
Yeah.
lots of folks in workplaces, what is our disposition towards conflict? And
Yeah.
then second, what are our capacities to get the best out of conflict? What are our capacities to vector conflict to help us make better decisions and have better relationships with each other?
Mm. I love the disposition question, and I've never had that been asked so directly in the workplace, but I have sort of seen it in real time, like after we maybe all took an assessment. I don't know if you're familiar with like the DISC assessment, but
Uh,
we all took something like that. And there was just a group of us who had a little higher on the red, which is about being very direct. And most of those folks were like, I love debate, and that kind of came up in the discussion. We're like, debate's great. It's fun, actually.
yeah, well,
And then other people were like looking at us like aliens. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that's the worst thing ever. And it was so as you're doing this, sort of assessment of where people stand on the disposition, and you mentioned kind of the organization, the team, and the individual. So ITJ generally like debate. I don't want it to get too heated, but I like when it gets a little bit spicy. My team might be like a mixed bag of folks, and and then the organization the same. How do you figure out, or how do you construct the team or organizational disposition, knowing that everybody shows up differently on an individual basis?
great question. So I talked about once we get a little more high tech on the issue of
Mm-hmm.
how we relate to conflict. So let's answer that first question of what's our disposition and try to answer it as honestly as
Yeah.
possible, both for myself, the team that I'm in, and the broader organization, because I might find myself being, let's say, pro conflict. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
debater like you, TJ, but I
Yeah.
find myself in a team where the messaging around conflict is pretty stifling, that
Yeah.
it's more of a conformist culture. Let's get in line as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Get all of us get on the same page, to use the jargon.
Mm-hmm.
But then I actually get some really confusing messages about the value of individual perspectives, but also the value of getting work done efficiently as quickly as possible from the organization. So I don't really know which way is up as
Yeah.
far as the organizational culture. So how do we make sense of those? So that's step one of kind of getting a higher tech version of an answer
Mm-hmm.
to my question.
Yeah.
Another way to high tech it out is to talk about situational comfort with conflict. So for me, autobiographically, I'm very comfortable with conflict with relative strangers. I'm very comfortable with conflict, even like you, maybe like a little bit of a psychopath, where I enjoy some professional conflict at work. And I could have freeze reactions or flight reactions if it's closer to home, if it's
Mm,
familial, if it
yeah.
feels relational. But that can also not just be walks of life where I have different attitudes towards conflict. So it's not like
Hmm.
I'm pro conflict across the board. Some situations,
Yeah.
yes, some no,
I get
but
that.
also in terms of topics. So I
Mm,
work with folks in workplaces, and another question we have is how do we feel about conflict up? So with
hmm.
managers, with C-suites, with SVPs, how do we feel about conflict between? So more
Hmm.
peer-to-peer. How do
Yeah.
we feel about conflict down with perhaps direct reports or employees? And then
Mm,
how do we feel about conflict in and out?
yeah.
So intra-departmental or interdepartmental, or even
Hmm.
between organizations and clients.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can imagine there's some complex stuff happening there. I mean, I think about, I worked in advertising for years and, you know, there's definitely a fair amount of conflict between departments. I was in the creative department and often there would be conflict with the client services department. The stereotype would be creatives want to do whatever they want. We want to push the envelope, do the craziest, weirdest stuff. And the client services team wants to make the client happy, which may mean tamp down on some of that stuff. Now, that's obviously not always true, but a lot of times people walk into an ad agency with that story already burned in. And so as soon as an account person says, well, the client said something last week that makes me wonder if that might not be a good idea. You're like, oh, come on, man. Like that's already there. So if that's true, there is already that conflict and it's not the healthiest, meaning it's more like just we're going to bump heads every time and we're going to be right in our various stations, right? What, what kinds of things help us still allow for the different perspectives, but also say, how do we get something good out of that tension?
So the trainings I run are all built on three distinctions, and I'll go through these quickly and we can dive in wherever you want to dive in. But
Yeah.
three distinctions to have healthier conflict within ourselves, within our teams, within our organizations, and maybe even all of our relationships. But this is Desuckify work, so we'll stay there.
Yeah.
So the first distinction is proactive and reactive approaches to conflict. So you talked at the top about, we expect good communication, but we don't really teach good communication.
Mm-hmm.
We expect maybe to have healthy conflict, and so we're in a reactive role. So what are
Mm-hmm.
the kinds of skills that can be helpful to take the temperature down, to do mediation, to do facilitation, to do conflict de-escalation, to do relational management? Even if this conversation is tough, let's live to fight another day.
Mm-hmm.
But then proactively, what are we doing on the front end to enable those conversations to happen? Are
Yeah.
we talking about norms of decorum? Are we talking about norms of how long people get to talk? Are we talking about norms of the topic? Have
Mm,
we agreed upon what we want out of this conversation? Do we want mutual understanding? Do we want to make policy? So proactive and reactive are really important, and not
yeah.
just being reactive, but being
Yeah.
proactive. The second one is I really like to make distinctions between what happens within ourselves and what happens between us. So
Mm,
we can talk about skill building around how do you and I talk to one another in a way that norms healthy conflict. So that's the
mm-hmm.
between. But within, and this is more mindfulness work, what's going on within myself
Yeah.
as I'm reacting to conflict. So,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of my body, the kind of nervous system work that we were talking about earlier, but
Yeah.
also my cognitive biases, my
Mm-hmm.
desire for confirmation bias, my desire for motivated reasoning, my desire to norm or smooth over rough edges of conflict between us. The
Mm-hmm.
final one is the difference between debate and dialogue. So you talked for a second ago about wanting to be right. So that to me is somewhat of a debate skill, although I
Yeah.
think red teaming or stress testing can also be a kind of debate skill. Let's test the strength of this idea through counter arguments
Mm,
and other approaches to the case or other bits of evidence. But also sometimes it's really important in workplaces to have dialogue and just let go of winning. And I
mm,
just want to curiously and compassionately see the world as you see the world. I'm not using this as an opportunity to persuade you.
mm-hmm.
When I ask follow-up questions, and I'm not asking them in a gotcha way or to show errors in your reasoning or your logic, but
Mm-hmm.
truly to understand. So those three, proactive, reactive, within and between, and when is it time to debate and when is it time to have dialogue, sort of like the Roadhouse idea,
Yeah.
the time to be nice and the time to be not nice.
I love that. You're getting some good references in here today.
They're also dated.
That's all right. I'm dated, so I'm right there with you. The proactive reactive is definitely interesting, you know. I think most of us probably are experiencing the bulk of our conflict in reactive mode, and to the extent that there are norms, I'm not sure how well people are fully aware of them. They're kind of slippery at times. They're not always well defined. They might even be siloed, meaning certain people, certain groups, certain teams have slightly different norms within a larger organization. So you might be okay with conflict with this group, and then you go over here and it's like, whoa, their barometer is just set differently, and they're like more, let's just say they're more anti-conflict or whatever, and you show up differently. So, you know, I think about how do you go about creating and defining and holding norms in a way that doesn't veer into what could be like almost a totalitarian 1984-ish, like, you know, where the rules become so important that we lose sight of what the rules are serving. It seems like there's probably a balance to be struck there.
Yeah, that's a great question. And workplaces are funny places to do this because on the one hand, there are democratic functions in workplaces that where we all get a say, and on the other hand, sometimes the buck stops at one desk, and
Yeah.
so it is the theater of a democracy, not the
Yeah.
actuality of a democracy. So,
Mm-hmm.
quick answer to that, and it's a great question, which is one, make sure that the rules are not words that I would use, norms more
Yeah.
so. So, and it's
Mm-hmm.
tough to have a totalitarian norm, but that can lead to groupthink and over conformity if the norm is too widespread and not questionable. So
Mm-hmm.
your point is well taken there. So are the norms co-created? In other words, have we had a conversation about the norms ahead of
Mm-hmm.
time as opposed to somebody just dictating the norms?
Yeah.
The second is, do we consistently call attention to the norms regardless of who is running afoul of them? So there is kind of equal protection under the law, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak.
Yeah.
And then the people have an opportunity to be called back in if they have had a momentary lapse in judgment. That's one way to do it. The
Yeah.
final one, and I really think that it's the most obvious one and the most frustrating one because it's really hard to come to grips with, which is to talk about our collective purpose in meetings.
Mm.
And so sometimes we want assent in meetings? Do we want action items and marching orders in
Mm.
meetings? Do we just simply want mutual understanding and moments of information sharing? And so
Yeah.
places that we can talk about where there's conflict, what do we want out of this conversation?
Mm-hmm.
If we just want mutual understanding, I sort of put that on the dialogue side of the ledger.
Yeah.
If we want to hash out what's true and what's not true, what's probably not true, okay, there's two competing values here, and how are we going to adjudicate between those competing values? Then, okay, maybe we do need to have a debate, and we can talk about situational norms associated with argumentative give and take.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that distinction. And I've heard people talk about just having a very simple agenda at meetings, which mostly the agendas that I see at meetings are more like the substance of what we're talking about, but they very rarely do what you just talked about, which is elevate to what is the actual goal of this meeting? Because you put 10 people at a table and there might be 7 or 8 different goals floating around in our heads. And so I'm in like, let's
Mhm.
stress test this idea mode. Somebody else is like, I just want people to understand the idea. And somebody else might have something completely unrelated that neither of us can even imagine what it is. Maybe they're just like, I'm just here to like feel connected to everybody or
That is
whatever
exactly
it
right.
is.
That is exactly.
So making that just a very simple expectation of if you're going to set up a meeting, beyond the topic is what are we aiming for here?
Yeah.
It seems very simple, but I rarely see it.
It's really hard to do because it does require a sense of thoughtfulness. There is this sense that when we do things that our reasoning is self-evident.
Mm-hmm.
It's obvious to everybody why we're here, and so why do we need to waste any time talking
Yep.
about it? But even a simple sentence like, This meeting for me, I called this meeting. This meeting for me will be a huge success if
Mm,
insert
yeah.
purpose here,
Mm-hmm.
have a quick round on reflecting on that purpose, and then go forward. So I'm
Yeah.
not asking for folks to be hyper meta, spend
Yeah.
30 minutes talking about
Talking
what they
about
want
why
to
we're
talk
here.
about.
Yeah, I get that. And I think, you know, as humans, we're probably going to do that sometimes anyways, because we're just, weird that way and we can spin out. But I'd still rather see us at least try to get that agreement on why are we here. You mentioned the idea of kind of conflict up and down in the organization, and that intrigues me a little bit because a lot of people talk about the idea of power, you know, in all phases of life, but I think in the workplace it's a tricky topic, right? Because I think about my own love and appreciation for healthy debate, and so I may extend that both up and down, and I know I have. And I also know at times I've probably done it in a way that either rubbed people the wrong way or, felt made people feel a little bit fearful or, excluded or whatever. Like all those things seem like they can happen. So how do you, as you're, kind of creating those norms, how do you do it in a way that I think the fear is going to be, okay, the CEO is going to sort of nod his head or her head along, but at the end of the day, they're not going to tolerate any conflict coming up the ladder. So, what do you think is most successful at allowing for there to be some version of healthy conflict that moves up and down the organization?
Are you asking from the perspective of the leader, or are you asking from the perspective of somebody arguing with somebody who doesn't want to be argued with?
Well, I guess both would be interesting. My first thought is if you're leading a company, what helps actually make that norm stick? What does the leader need to do to really embrace the norm and not kind of have it be wallpaper?
The number one goal I work on with any of the three distinctions, debate, dialogue, within, between, and proactive and reactive, is always towards perspective taking.
Mm-hmm.
And again, perspective taking, the extent to which I can put your glasses or your shoes or your hat or whatever the clothing metaphor is.
Yeah.
Perspective taking is a disposition. It is a
Mm-hmm.
willingness to be humble, to counter my own default mode network and really try to see the world and interpret it as you do.
Yeah.
But it is also a practice. And so creating norms and communication opportunities for perspective taking, where
Mm-hmm.
leaders inhabit the position of a subordinate and subordinates inhabit the position of a leader. And that can
Mm.
be in the form of a negotiation, that can be in the form of even a game, where we have to make a decision, but we try to argue as the other person
Mm-hmm.
on behalf of that, so we can kind of soften our egoic reactions to
Oh
our
yeah.
fiefdoms, to our territories and such.
Mm.
The other one is I talk a lot about a culture of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I am a leader, I'm hopefully asking for lots of feedback, honestly, and
Mm-hmm.
then encouraging feedback to be given and then modeling the giving of feedback. And so how can we activate principles of reciprocity where I give and receive feedback equally well? Both the
Mm-hmm.
process of it and the actuality of giving it in a judicious,
Mm-hmm.
respectful, but also incisive sort of a way. So perspective taking and building a culture of feedback, speaking from the perspective of a leader.
Yeah.
Now, arguing up with somebody who doesn't want to be argued with is a totally different animal, as you well know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that one, my instinct says sometimes you gotta swallow it a little bit in that instance, right? Because I know I've gotten in trouble this way. Like I remember working at a place where I was pretty comfortable, you know, arguing up. And I was actually working with a coach who kind of like was like, sure, that's where you want to go. I mean, I get where you're coming from, but just think about, if they're resisting it, what does that
Uh-huh.
really mean to you? And so I'm curious, what's your take on that? If you're seeing and feeling a lot of resistance, is the best thing to just kind of shut it down for now, or what do you do?
In my work, the thing that I push most often against is a negativity bias about conflict,
Mm-hmm.
that we, I think, as humans, have a negativity bias about keeping ourselves safe, keeping
Yeah.
ourselves fed, keeping
Mm-hmm.
roofs over our head, and so forth. And so it makes sense that we would fear worst case scenarios in lots of.
Yeah.
And in my sense is that the greatest enemy to connection and many times the greatest enemy to persuasion is not excessive antagonism or unhealthy conflict,
Mm.
but is the chilling effect that comes from a fear of unhealthy conflict. So
Mm.
I do absolutely situationally think that
Yeah.
there are times when you should need to swallow it.
Yeah.
You need to practice what is both self-preservation, but also relationally what
Mm-hmm.
some political scientists talk about as forbearance.
Yeah.
Just not trying to land all your punches at the same time, but not
Yeah.
necessarily pulling them all either, to
Yeah.
quote a wonderful book called Mere Civility.
Mm.
And so have some situational judgment, of course, but I don't know. We have really great data that says that people are most likely to be persuaded in consistent relationships where they feel seen and heard.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing a nice job helping the other person feel seen and heard, I wouldn't be super afraid to make your point in addition to that, to make the
Yeah.
ask as well. Because again, just to quote, to keep on doing the references,
Yeah.
you're gonna miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yeah.
And sometimes the unwillingness to take the shot is your own greatest detriment.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. If you're liking what you hear and like the idea of making work not suck, I invite you to schedule a free half-hour discovery session. What role is work playing in your life right now? Let's talk about it. All right, back to the show. I think that's a good point. And I think if I look back to some of my own experience with this, I'm thinking about your example of kind of seeing the other person's perspective, kind of putting yourself in their shoes. I probably didn't do a great job of that. I was probably standing really firmly in my own shoes
Huh.
and going, yeah, but, you know, this is what matters, and not going, okay, if I was running this company, how might this land for me and how might it land better? And I love the concept of actually inviting people who are maybe in some conflict or having a difficult conversation to try on the other person's shoes and actually go like, what would it feel like from their perspective? Like, articulate it. What do you think they're feeling? What are they worried about? What are they wanting? You talk about
Uh-huh.
being seen. I mean, what better way to do that than to invite people to actually, express that and then be open to the feedback of some of that is where I'm coming from. And some of that, maybe there's bias in there, right?
Mhm.
You know, but I love that exercise. I think sometimes I think we can resist what can feel like almost an academic exercise in the workplace. Like, let's just hash it out.
Mhm.
But I actually think that some of the things you're introducing here, if they became normed, would be quite helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, one way that we can do this work too is I talk a lot about what are we doing in conversations to activate a really basic human desire for reciprocity.
Mm.
And so maybe that is something as simple as a genuine compliment. I
Mm-hmm.
really like your Bruce Springsteen shirt, and you're like, well, what can I figure out about him that I want to
Yeah.
give a compliment in return? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's something about communicating vulnerability. Look, this is a thing about which that I don't have 100% certainty. I have a
Mm-hmm.
strong feeling,
Yeah.
but I'm not coming to you pretending to be the Oracle at Delphi here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not coming at you at a place of perfection in the hope that it'll trigger some vulnerability, humility in return. Sometimes that's reciprocity around perspective taking and then trying to, as charitably as possible, do what some therapists call the MRI or the MCI, which stand for the most reasonable interpretation of what the other person is saying, or
Mm-hmm.
the most charitable
Yeah.
interpretation of what the other person is saying.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can show you that I'm doing that for you,
Yeah.
it's not 100% guaranteed that you'll do that for me, but it does plant a decent seed there. So there's lots of ways to integrate the principle of reciprocity for relationship building again, and
Mm-hmm.
this is so that people feel seen, heard, safe, they like being around you, and then
Mm-hmm.
that opens up either the chance for just a more durable relationship in which you can have conflict, and maybe in the end you get your way too because you're more persuasive in that kind of an environment. So it's
Yeah.
it's potentially a double win.
Yeah. Hmm. I want to zoom out a little bit because I think
Mm.
we've touched on a little bit of like the notion that there's just a lot of conflict in the air, in the water, everywhere we go. And, my take, at least as part of the explanation, is we've just never been so exposed to so many different viewpoints, right? You go back 30 years or whatever, and I had vague senses of what even some of my closer friends maybe believed about any given issue or topic. And now I know not only what they believe and my coworkers believe and random people like, and it creates what feels like some kind of cognitive dissonance because it's like I want to like this person, but they're holding views that I don't like. And how in the world can I do that? So I need to fight, or I need to run, or I need to block them. And so we're absorbing so much information. And I have to imagine that, coming back to the nervous system, it's messing with that. What are you seeing in terms of what's maybe upped the
Huh.
conflict meter a bit over recent years?
Yeah, and this is an interesting meta discussion about conflict in the broader culture, is
Yeah.
zooming out from work a bit,
Mm-hmm.
which is some days I wake up and I feel like you, which is that we are a group of people of all humans that have ever existed. We have the most access to information, and yet we know the least of it. Of all
Mm-hmm.
humans who have ever existed, we have the most stories about conflict in our lives. And so we develop unhealthy relationships with it. And then
Mm-hmm.
other days I wake up and I think some of the problem in the world is that we have too little conflict, that
Mm-hmm.
we've outsourced our conflicts to either passive aggressive means or to
Mm-hmm.
end arounds, that we have created systems and structures where we don't have to have conflicts. I mean, how many people in relationships have a fight they so desperately need to have for the relationship to move forward and spend years circling around the drain of
Mm-hmm.
that fight. And that could be true in a family relationship, a romantic relationship, and a workplace relationship.
Yeah.
And so I do, and I think that if you zoom way out, what I've described is a cultural fight flight, a cultural dysregulation where we're
Mm-hmm.
oversaturated with algorithmic anger and
Mm.
extreme examples of conflict gone horribly awry.
Yeah.
And frankly, we're oversaturated with conflict avoidance and communication apprehension on
Mm-hmm.
the other hand. And
Yeah.
communication apprehension is not a great story,
Yeah.
whereas excessive antagonism and somebody Karening on an airplane or something like that
Yeah.
is a great story, right?
Yeah.
Me being quiet in an argument is never going to be a viral video. It's hard for me to imagine a circumstance in which it would become
Yeah.
viral. Maybe there is one.
Yeah.
But somebody freaking out in a Dunkin' Donuts,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to imagine that because I saw it this morning.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I like the algorithmic notion too, right? So there's a lot of that driving the choices because the great story is what gets attention
Mm.
online. And you talk about wanting to be seen. So we're all wired in some way to want to have the story that has us be seen, even if we're not being seen in our best light. There's still something about like, well, at least you saw me. I
Hmm.
screamed on the
Hmm.
plane. I screamed at the Dunkin' Donuts. I yelled at somebody's dog or whatever. Like all the things that show up all the time. Like it's probably some kind of substitute for genuinely being seen for us is what it feels like. And then we're apt to sort of engage in some of those spaces. And then you show up at work and it's kind of, to pull a sort of old reference is the Mike Tyson quote about like everybody has something to say until, they're afraid of being punched in the mouth or whatever the line
Hmm.
is. Like,
Everybody's got a plan.
yeah, like, so when we get in person, we a lot of times we're shutting down or that passive aggressive thing. I think about workplace politics, and very often that's just natural. It's like the
Hmm.
body building new arteries to go around clogged arteries. Okay, if we're not going to have the direct conflict, I'm gonna find a way around, and I'm gonna create these political networks that
Hmm.
that are super passive aggressive. So
Hmm.
when that happens, and you've got this broader cultural conflict thing doing, a number on our nervous system, what if you step into an organization that's in the midst of all that, and there's a lot of politics and there's a lot of passive aggressiveness, where do you start?
Well, the boxing metaphor is not a bad one. There's
Yeah.
a lovely book called Metaphors We Live By, and we talk a
Mm-hmm.
lot about how Americans and maybe the West in general or English speakers have a tortured relationship with conflict, where if you think about the metaphors we use to describe an argument,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes they're very martial or they're warfare. You shot all of my arguments down,
Yeah.
those sorts of metaphors. And so the boxing metaphor is appropriate there, not because it's accurate, but because we have to build up some resilience to know that we can live to fight another day and be in a fight. And so
Yeah.
some of the some of the coaching, some of the acculturation to fighting in a literal sense is being comfortable being in a ring in which fists are flying, and then being comfortable being in a ring in which you might get hit, but you're going to survive it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the same is true with arguments. So instead of turtling up and fleeing or freezing in a conflict, you can actually participate. And then if you actually get hit, it's not the end of the round. It's not
Yeah.
the end of the boxing match. I can take a blow. And so to what extent can we gamify these things and do the perspective taking that I was talking about earlier? So
Mm-hmm.
me being assigned to defend argumentatively a position I don't necessarily defend for the sake of a meeting,
Yeah.
and then people role playing different arguments against this position, it's taken my ego out of it because I'm not being asked to defend my baby. It's
Yeah.
not my idea that I have to own and then take all comers and run this kind of like kumite blood
Mm-hmm.
sport gauntlet. And then if I lose, I don't just lose an idea, I lose an ego and I
Yeah.
risk public embarrassment. So
Mm.
if we take the ego, the fiefdom, the territoriality of the idea out of it, and okay, Mike, make the best case for TJ's idea at tomorrow's meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And then TJ, offer the most reasonable arguments you can against your own idea, or have
Mm-hmm.
somebody else do it. You get my
Yeah.
idea. These can really take the ego out of it. These can really take territoriality out of it, and hopefully both increase our facility with the language, facility with the arguments, but also our nervous system's capacity to stay in the room and not just live to fight another day, but maybe even enjoy it and learn something out of it, because controlled antagonism is not just a good way to make decisions,
Yeah.
but it's also potentially fun.
Yeah. I can see it being fun, right? Because I think as soon as you strip away the ego, like I'm 10 pounds lighter, I
Mm.
just feel it immediately when I'm like, oh, I'm not attached to that for my identity. I don't have the fear of reputational damage and being,
Hmm.
excommunicated or whatever the fear was, probably going back a little bit. And it makes me wonder, I think about the traditional way work often gets shared, certainly in ad agencies. We have some ideas, we go to the client with those ideas, and the purpose, there's more than one purpose in that meeting. The first purpose is articulate the idea in a way that hopefully the folks hearing it understand it. But then there is okay, now let's move into not just simply understanding it, but deciding whether you like that idea and you think it's serving the purpose based on the initial brief that was given us to do the work. And I wonder, should those be two different meetings? Meeting one, we're just coming in and we're going to articulate three ideas for you. And we just want to
Sure.
make sure by the end, you all feel like you understand them and maybe can voice back to us your version of what those ideas mean. That's it. And then in 2 or 3 days' time, we're going to come back and I'm going to ask you, the client, to argue, for the ideas, and I'm going to argue against them or whatever, some version of what you're saying, so that there's less muddiness in the meeting about what are we really trying to do here. Because sometimes it can feel very much like, I don't think they really get that idea and they're already telling me they hate it. And so is there value in sort of stepping the process a little bit?
Yeah, a few more distinctions along those lines, because it's a great point, which is meetings or communication to understand and
Mm-hmm.
convey information, meetings to understand and get buy-in or assent. So
Yeah.
that's a big difference between understanding and assent.
Yeah.
And then there's a big difference between assent and action.
Yeah.
So what do I want you to do as a result of this? And that's a three-step process. I always
Yeah.
hesitate to recommend more meetings. So maybe that's three meetings, maybe it's not. But
Yeah.
in any case, I just think more people need to think about, what does the best decision look like? So the
Mm-hmm.
best decision in most cases for me looks like you get it right. So we're seeing the world accurately.
Mm-hmm.
We had as much information from relevant stakeholders contributed to the decision-making process, not just so that we see the world accurately, but people feel
Mm-hmm.
bought into the decision-making process. And
Mm-hmm.
God forbid that process go awry because you and I are screaming at each other, but also, God forbid, and more likely this is the case, that I have relevant information that I fear sharing
Mm-hmm.
because I either don't want to give offense or I
Yeah.
don't want to step on somebody's toes. And so I just
Mm-hmm.
shut up.
Yeah.
And then the third one is, how do we cultivate the idea of a loyal opposition where even if I don't get my way in this decision, I trust the process well enough. So to me, those are the qualities of a good decision.
Yeah.
Obviously, we want good outcomes in those decisions, but even if we have good outcomes and people aren't bought into the process, there's a
Mm-hmm.
real collateral damage there relationally within organizations.
Yeah.
Because we can have all sorts of problems with groupthink, but oftentimes what happens because of conflict avoidance is fake groupthink, where
Mm-hmm.
you, my boss, announce a new policy change in a meeting, and I nod and I nod and I show you, oh yeah,
Yeah.
yep, great idea, boss. And then I walk out of that meeting and I just flush it.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
do anything about it.
Yeah. It's the meeting after the meeting where everybody finally gets to say all the things they wanted to say, but they couldn't say it in front of the boss, in front of the client, in front of the person that they feel always, you know, jumps down their throat when they say something. And yeah, I mean, that's a norm in so many companies to sort of go, okay, what do we really think
Mhm.
now that we can talk freely? So if you can create a structure where you can actually get to that in the meeting, well, that's going to save us some meetings. And maybe that allows us to then maybe step the process, even if it's stepping the process by having a slightly longer meeting that says, okay,
Right.
step one here, we just want to make sure everybody can articulate what these ideas are and feel like you understand them. Okay, now we're going to shift into, we're going to try to make some, get some assent or not around these ideas. Yeah. So, one of the things that you talked about was this idea of bias. And I just wanted to come back to it real quick because we obviously all have bias. But what I've seen is, in efforts to combat bias, a lot of that work that's been done over the last, let's say, 10 years has not always been effective and oftentimes can even be run counter to its stated goals. And it ends up creating more problems than it's trying to start. How do you effectively manage bias? I don't think you can eliminate it. So I guess it's some sort of management or acknowledgement and dealing with those biases.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about biases, I talk about cognitive biases
Yeah.
largely,
Yeah.
the extent to which I'm a good actor and you're a bad actor. I have what people call naive realism, that I
Mm-hmm.
see the world accurately and you see the world inaccurately. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, and so forth, kind of representative anecdotes, hasty
Mm-hmm.
generalizations, these types of things.
Yeah.
So I really encourage folks to think very thoughtfully about systems of decision making there. And so
Mm-hmm.
making sure that's a norm that's shared amongst lots of people, not just one person talking about it. And
Yeah.
so this is a place that I think these norms of dialogue and debate can be really effective, which is when people are making affirmative cases for ideas, then introducing the potential for cognitive bias as we're steel manning or red teaming or stress testing, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
phraseology want to use is,
Yeah.
those is really, really helpful. So again, it's the distinction I made at the top, within and between. So if we're looking for effective communication, working on our dispositions, working on our biases is a great place to start. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty bad place to stop
Yeah.
because there's a lovely book called How Minds Change,
Mm-hmm.
where the author talks about the phrase that stands out to me is, if you're in a debate with yourself, you're going to win,
Mm.
which is to say that we will argue ourselves. We have, to quote another book, press secretaries inside of our head who
Mm.
are working to reduce our cognitive dissonance and maximize our egos.
Mm.
And if left to my own devices, that is most likely where I'm going to end up. And so asking me to do dispositional work is really effective, is really necessary, but it's
Yeah.
not necessarily effective to train the fox to stand in front of the hen house and not do a bad job and not
Mm,
mess up. So then
yep.
it has to be put into a communication system in which I am made vulnerable to you and you are made vulnerable to me
Hmm.
in a bi-directional process that hopefully introduces some limited egos, like I was talking about with perspective taking,
Yeah.
and to come back to a simple word, and makes it enjoyable and makes it somewhat fun at the same time.
Yeah. I think that's key. I mean, anybody who's followed this show at all, that's a constant refrain is we just need to be having more fun at work because I think
Yeah.
that's we actually do a lot better work when we're lightened a little bit by having that fun and it seems to open up our brains in different ways when it creates kind of a flow state, I think, when we're having more fun with these kinds of processes. So I love that take. The one thing I want to check in on with you is, we're talking a lot about conflict and how to have healthy conflict. And I think, you've created this work around civility and having healthy conflict. What impact are you wanting to have through this work you're doing?
Wow. What a great question. I just want to be remembered, TJ. I just want people to know that I was alive.
Yeah.
No, I think in the end, I get real joy out of seeing people when they are the most free to be themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we have dysregulation towards conflict, that we either find ourselves imprisoned by our rage reactions
Mm-hmm.
or imprisoned by our fear reactions. And you know
Mm-hmm.
that feeling when a conversation reaches a flow state or a
Mm-hmm.
relationship reaches a flow state and you feel like you really know somebody.
Yeah.
And I don't love this phrase, but like an authentic self comes out,
Yeah.
and helping people reach those places is a place that I get real joy.
Yeah.
Selfishly, I love assisting in that endeavor. And I also love seeing the end result of it. And so if
Yeah.
I'm wanting to achieve something, I'm wanting to achieve helping people have more productive, healthier, relationally affirming conflicts and helping one another see one another's humanity.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of all the ways in which we're the same and all the ways in which we're different. And those are
Yeah.
kind of my big goals. And the civility initiative that I direct, we do lots of work around. We've been talking about workplace stuff, but of course
Yeah.
we do stuff with governments in terms of healthy conflict there, with students trying to learn something about the world and how do
Mm-hmm.
they find and assess evidence about whether they're in anthropology or biology or communication or wherever else
Mm.
and so forth. So, but in all of those walks of life, if we can find healthier conflict and better dialogue, then I'm pretty happy.
Yeah. I mean, I love the relational part of it. I love the authentic self part of it. And I think
Hmm.
what I would say is that's obviously a very buzzy term, but what you're doing, at least to me, it feels like you're putting some meat behind it so that like it's not just, hey, show up and be your authentic self. It's like actually let's learn how to create environments where people can engage in ways where that authentic self can emerge
Yeah.
and there's not and it's safe for it to happen because it's not really safe in a lot of places. You show up and then you immediately get it smacked down and then you just go right back into the shell. I guess.
I do think there's something, and I'm glad the authenticity thing came up because it's a hobby horse of mine, which is there is in a culture that promotes increasingly, hopefully, effective dialogue and me seeing you in all of your you-ness and
Yeah.
vice versa, and showing up and being authentic. There's a sense in which all we're doing is reactive conflict de-escalation, and we're not,
Mm,
to use a metaphor I love, which is shaking the snow globe.
mm,
So if I am being told to show up and reaffirm the position that I'm already in, because that's my so-called authentic position, and
yeah.
you are doing the same, the best that we're ever going to do is have a de-escalated conflict, which is not the same thing as
Yeah.
having a healthy conflict or
Mm-hmm.
what we might paradoxically call an authentic conflict.
Yeah.
Until we can shake the snow globe and really start to see one another's point of view and then really assess what we think the best evidence for these ideas is, then we're going to be stuck. We're going to be rerouted in the same ideas. Maybe it's a little bit less unhealthy, a little bit less toxic, but
Mm-hmm.
can't really harness the benefits of productive friction.
Yeah. I think that kind of takes me back to the hold on loosely but don't let go, meaning if you can engage in conflict where that your identity of who you are authentically is not so tightly held
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
there's room for that to continue to grow and evolve, then the conflict allows us to both learn more, get to truth, and grow our authentic selves and evolve them in a way. So I love how that frames out. I know I've been asking you a bunch of questions here. I'd love to give you a chance to throw one out to the audience. Do you have a question for them?
I always like to know why people listen to podcasts. What
Yeah.
is it they like about not just the info, because I think people think about this as information, but oftentimes I think about media relationships, they're parasocial relationships. These are
Yeah.
people I like spending time with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would love to know from the audience why they enjoy so consistently hanging out with TJ.
I like that question. I'm 20% afraid of the answers, but I'll
Yeah,
see what people say. Uh,
vulnerability, right? Yeah, there's lots of admirable qualities that I'm sure that they will enumerate for you. But that's the question that came up for me because I always wondered about,
yeah.
it's one thing to talk about being entertained or informed, but this other
Yeah.
thing, just I like spending time with this guy. And
Yeah.
what
It's a
is it?
really, it's a good insight because that definitely rings true for a lot of the shows I listen to. Um, so if you could wave a magic wand and create a fully desuckified work world, what would that world look like?
You're probably beating a dead horse here, but there would be healthier and more consistent conflict that would enable better decision making, not necessarily, although I do think it would be more accurate decision making, but it would be greater buy-in to the
Mm,
outcomes of those decisions
yeah.
because of a healthier and more fun process. So that would
Mm,
be and then back to the top too, is that I don't think we have to make work our everything.
yeah.
If anything, if we have all of our eggs in one basket and that basket starts to fray, then we
Hmm.
find ourselves feeling excessively vulnerable,
Yeah.
extremely precarious. And so
Hmm.
let's diversify a little bit. But my hobby horse is healthier conflict. And so
Yeah.
I would love to see more systems and structures. And more specifically, though, I would like to see companies invest and be thoughtful about the ways in which they're investing and incentivizing communication training
Hmm.
broadly and healthy conflict more specifically, as opposed
Yeah.
to just expecting both to happen and punishing it when it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. So now we're going to have some fun. Speaking of fun, if you listen to my show, you'll hear some sounds at the beginning and at the end. It's mostly cats meowing because I'm sort of cat obsessed, but I always invite the guest to bring a sound, make a sound, um, to add to the show. Do you have something for us?
I spun on this for longer than I'll tell your audience about. I really thought about it, and I
Okay.
and I came up with two, and so I'm just going to share both. So I'm going to be greedy. I'm going to be a hog, and I'm
Love
going
it.
to share both. So the first one, and they're both very autobiographical. They're both sounds I love. So this is just me being both a hog and an egomaniac.
Hmm.
So I love the sound of a pen clicking
Hmm.
when somebody else is talking to signify that I'm taking something that you said so seriously and it's so memorable that I want to write it down because I don't trust myself to remember it. I
Hmm.
love that sound of somebody getting out a pen and clicking it while you're talking.
Hmm.
And then I also love what I also love about it is not just the kind of cliched phrase active listening. I mean, there's
Yeah.
nothing more actively listening than me writing down what you're saying,
Hmm.
but also it signifies that I take what you say very seriously, but I also take what I'm saying very seriously because in many cases it's followed by me writing down what I would like to say in
Hmm.
return. So it's an act of kind of like double respect. I
Yeah.
respect what you said so much, and I respect what I want to say so much too, in a bidirectional sense.
Hmm.
The same thing, and this is more of the verbal version of that, of the pin click, is when you're speaking to somebody and somebody says, "Mm," and what they're signifying with that is not necessarily assent,
Hmm.
right? Not necessarily understanding, not an uh-huh, not like a fawning, like, oh yeah, uh-huh, great point, but just that really impacted me. What you just said made me think, and it's in many cases it's unconscious
Yeah.
as the body's verbal unconscious response to being vulnerable enough to being impacted by somebody else's words. And I
Yeah.
find real beauty, majesty in that kind of really simple one syllable evidence of human connection. So those are my two. A
I
pen
love that.
clicking and
Yeah, I love both of those. I think I'm a serial because I just can't sometimes notice it. I'm like, oh yeah, I did that again. But I get it. It feels reflexive.
Right.
It just comes out when something strikes a nerve for you. So the last question, I just, always like to know, like, how can people track you down online, learn more about the work you're doing?
Thanks for that. When We Disagree is the podcast that I host, and we're over 100 episodes now. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. Every episode is a memorable conflict in somebody's life, and every guest answers one question and one question only, which is, what's a disagreement you can't get out of your head? And over a lot of episodes, we've had everything from mom to MAGA and dad to conspiracies about the Denver airport. And so I relish the opportunity to help people tell and to enable people to tell as many different conflict stories in their lives that they find memorable and emotional and powerful. But also it's a vehicle for us to then broaden out and talk about how we remember conflict, how we relate to conflict, what we can get better at in conflict, and so forth. And then you can find me, my academic work, teaching, and then the work I do at the Civility Initiative by looking us up at the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston.
Okay. And you're on LinkedIn as well, right?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And I have an incredibly common name, Michael Lee. So good luck.
I'll be sure to get the link to the correct one so people don't have to scour LinkedIn. Well, Michael, this has been a delightful conversation. I think a very much needed topic. I think we're all feeling the weight of the conflicts in our lives and the avoidance often of those conflicts in our lives. And yeah, let's make life a little more engaging and fun by embracing the conflict and having the tools to do it in a healthy way.
That's right. Thanks a ton for having me on the show. This has been a real delight.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the DesuckifyWork podcast. And a huge thanks to Michael for bringing a healthy perspective on conflict to the show. You can follow Michael on LinkedIn and check out the Civility Initiative at the University of Charleston to learn more about his work and his podcast, When We Disagree. If you enjoyed the conversation and would like to find some calm in the chaos of work, I invite you to schedule a free half-hour discovery session. Type meow in the calendar invite, and I'll also send you a free DesuckifyWork t-shirt. Bye, everyone.